Chris, and I'm going to show you how to use the Guideline foot with the guidelines on your Baby Lock Radiance. Let's take a look at the Guideline foot and all the pieces that come with it. The first thing that we have is our instruction sheet that gives graphics of the foot, putting it in position along with written words. Next, we have a set of templates. Now, the templates are based on your left needle position and your center needle position, and they have markings for the 1/4 inch, 3/8, and 5/8 inch seam. Before you start using these though, you're going to want to make sure to take off that plastic covering that sits on top so that you have a clear foot. All you'll do is just grab that corner, pull that off, and now you have a clear view. Later in the video, we'll go through why you really want to use these templates or where you'll use these templates. But the first thing that we have to do is actually put the foot on the machine. And before I do anything, I'm actually going to select the needle exchange key and lock that screen, okay? And that just prevents me from accidentally bumping it as I'm putting this on. The second thing that I actually do is I take the thread, while my machine is threaded, I take that thread out of the needle just so it doesn't get in the way. And I'm going to take off the foot that happens to be on my machine by pressing that release lever on the back side of the ankle. Now, when we take a look at the foot, we're going to want to notice a couple of key components or parts. You have your opening for where that needle is going to go, so you have that full width there. You also have what we call is a spring system, and this spring system controls this position here and the little legs that come out. This keeps the foot flat on the fabric so that your guideline that you're projecting is easily seen in the foot and then also on your fabric. Now, when I place this in position, I want to make sure that my foot is on the bed of the machine, and then I'm going to slide that forward, keeping that little bracket in front of the ankle, and I'm going to line up that pin underneath the position on that ankle. And I'm going to use both hands just like this, slide that forward. And at this point here, because it's a spring, there's a little bit of tension on it. So I'm going to have to give it a little push. That pin's right underneath that ankle. And now I'm going to go straight up, and you can hear that click in place. Now you're probably wondering, okay, why can't I just put the foot on the bed of the machine, lower it down, and it will snap in place? You can't, because this spring has got a lot of tension on it, so you almost have to push that into position. If you try to do it with one hand here and one hand here lowering it, can you see how that's tilted? It's not going to connect. So the best way, again, is to, and we'll do it one more time because I'm going to release that, that's all I do to release it, is to push it back, line up the pin with that groove on the ankle, and push it up, and then you'll hear it click in place. And then you lower it, and you can see how that foot sits on the bed of your machine. Now, if I want to take the foot off because I'm ready to use another foot, raise that presser foot, and you probably wanted to use that needle exchange. Press the release lever on the back side and bring the foot straight down, bring it straight forward, and that bracket slides right underneath that needle so you don't have to worry about clipping that needle or touching that needle. Okay, so we're back in position. My next thing is I am going to thread my machine. I have to disengage that needle exchange. So I'm just going to back up to that key, press the thread the needle. So I'm ready to put my template in position, and I'm going to use the left needle. Remember, you have a left needle position and you have a right needle or center needle position for your templates. They are not self-adhesive. You can put them on and you can also remove them at any time. You don't need to leave them on the entire time you're using the Guideline foot. We're going to take these little positions here on the template, these openings, and we're going to line them up with those notches on the foot. So I'm just going to place that over. Make sure that they're snug on those little posts. And then I just run my finger along the right side so that that side clips underneath the spring here, and then along the left side so that clips in place there. One of the reasons that we decided to do the templates with the dash marks on it is that when you're doing seams, sometimes it's really hard to see that guideline against that seam. So this acts as, I'm going to say, like a secondary alignment point. So I'm going to use the guideline, and then I'm going to, in this case, if I do that 1/4 inch, I would use that 1/4 inch marking. So I personally use both this and the guideline when I'm doing seams, and you can use it for other things, but they do not, again, have to live on your foot the entire time. To remove that, all that I'm going to do is simply grab that and just pull it up, set it over here, and then place it in a safe spot. Remember to take off that skin so that you can see, otherwise you're going to have a kind of a cloudy view. You can definitely see the difference if I go a little closer here between the skin off and the skin on. So now that we've got our foot in place, I think we're ready to actually start stitching. And the first thing we're going to start with is going to be our seams. One of the things that I use the Guideline for is seams. We're going to take a look at actually how I handle that. Now I've got that foot in position. I just need to get that needle threaded. And I am going to use a left needle position. So I'm going to use the 102. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to use that left needle template on my Guideline foot. So we're going to use that left needle template, align it in position on the foot, those notches with the openings, and slide that into place. And now I'm ready to go to the Guideline function on the machine. We're going to take a look at something that I do first before I actually even use a Guideline. And it's in the settings. I have found over time using this system on this machine and other machines is that I like to take the light down just one position. So typically your light is set at that number 5 setting. I took it to number 4. What that does is it allows those lights from the Guidelines to really pop so you can see it not only on the foot but on the fabric. And I think you have a better opportunity to really make sure everything is aligned. So I've got that taken care of. So we're just going to exit this screen and we're going to go back to our main screen. Now we get to set that Guideline. So we're going to select our Guideline key on the face of our machine, and that's going to pop up. Now we're going to do the main and the sub because we're doing a seam. But one of the things that I have found, again, through the usage of the Guideline is when I select my line length on this particular machine, the Radiance, I like to use either the middle or the smallest. And I actually bump that forward. What that does is that moves the line a little bit forward so that I can really see it inside of the foots. And if I put a piece of fabric underneath here, that Guideline is actually inside the foot. If I don't bump that forward to that 50 millimeters, I would probably only have a Guideline to about this point. Most of it will sit behind the foot. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to select that color of the hot pink for my main line, and that's going to depend upon your fabric. Okay, so always audition this before you actually go to your stitching and make sure that the color that you're selecting is visible on the fabric that you're stitching on. Then we're going to go to our subline. Oops, we're going to select close first, subline. And we're going to do, again, that straight line. We're going to select our color. And I chose, in this case, I chose that turquoise. Again, bright colors so I can see them. And I've got my subline position set at 1/4 of an inch. Okay, and that's 1/4 of an inch of what my main line is, which is currently lined up with that left needle. We're going to select close. And then what I'm going to do is place my first piece of fabric underneath here, and I'm going to start stitching. I always use a little bit of a cheater cloth at the beginning. That just helps me get started. Now when you look at the foot on the machine, you'll notice that it's sitting nice and flat. When I raise that presser foot, can you see that dip in it or that angle down? The back end of the foot will come up, the front end of the foot will stay down, and this has to do with that spring system holding that foot flat. So if you've ever worked on a serger, a couple of things that you typically will do is you can lift up the toe of the presser foot to slide that fabric. In this case, I can grab both sides and I can slide that right up to that needle. I'm going to lower that position. And now what I can see is when I did my line, I based it off of that center needle position, right? So don't panic here. I'm going to go back into that Guideline function. And what I have to do is I have to move that whole system over to the left to make sure that I'm lining up that main line with that 0 position on that template. And then my subline will be lined up with that 1/4 of an inch. Okay, I'm going to take a couple of stitches and then I'll introduce my first fabric. And if I have to, I might want to adjust that line to the right just ever so slightly. We'll just see when I get my fabric underneath here. Okay, my needle's going to stop in that down position. And then I'm going to slide my next piece of fabric. I'm doing a 1/4 inch seam, slide that right underneath. Can you see how I'm doing that? Now, do you see the beauty of why you have that guideline with that marked line on your template? One of the reasons for that is sometimes it gets really confusing when you've got that guideline and it kind of falls off that fabric edge and you got a little concerned about that. Now I have that black line that lines up. So it kind of acts as an additional line or a buffer. Now, if you can't see those lines, remember you can always go in and I can always change that color. So let's say on my subline, I wanted to change that to maybe the blue, or how about the orange? I think I can see the orange a little bit better. Let's see what the green is and see how that works. And I can see, I think the green is probably the better of the two. I'm going to close that. I'm going to close that, and I'm right back at my main screen. What I'm watching is everything that goes on here. I'm not paying attention to what goes on here. I'm watching what's going on in my foot. And typically my eye view when I'm using this foot for anything is going to be from right about here to probably right about here, depending upon where the length is. So if your line happens to fall off, don't worry, what you're watching is in here. It might be different back here, but it's always going to be the same right there. So that's that first cotton piece that I went through at a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to now just take a big fabric strip underneath. We're going to do the same thing. We're just going to slide this up underneath. We're going to line up that edge with the subline. Okay, I'm worried about the subline, and again, that black marking and the dashes on it really help me determine where that fabric edge is while I'm sewing. And again, I'm always watching in this area right here. I'm not paying attention about what's going on back there. And if you need to, you can always go back in and you can adjust or reposition these into a different position. Maybe I want to bring them a little closer to the right. Again, you're going to make that determination when you test everything prior to going on to your project. That's the one thing that I have learned in over my years of working on things, whether it's, you know, just a seam or it's something creative, is I am always testing, always testing. And if you look at where my left hand is, it's on that left side of that foot, always making sure that that fabric is guiding or being guided as I'm stitching. And when I come to the end, I'm going to stop, and then we're going to change our seam allowance to the next seam allowance, which actually happens to be that 3/8 of an inch. And we'll take a look at my seam allowance. And I can see, you know, I'm going to be honest with you, it's a little scant, but that's not actually a bad thing when you're piecing. Sometimes a scant needle meeting a little into that 1/4 inch works just fine. I would just make an adjustment on where this position here sits with my main line, because that subline is always going to follow that main line when I'm positioning that. Okay, so for our next seam, we're going to take a look at knits. Usually a 3/8 of an inch seam is used on knits, and you'll use that also in a lot of indie patterns. So I want to go to that subline, and I'm going to adjust that so that measurement says 3/8 of an inch. And we'll just keep pressing that plus until we get to that point, and it's that 9.53. And again, that's going to line up. Remember, you have that template there, and that's one of the reasons, as I said earlier, that we created that, is it just acts as a separate guideline. Now on this fabric, it's really hard to see those guidelines, so I would probably want to make a change here if I can find something that I can see a little bit better. But if I can't, I've got those markings on that template to help me out a little bit. And this is probably not the best fabric to have when you're stitching, but I think I'm going to leave it at that. We'll do pink and pink. How's that sound? Okay. And I can still see that main line, and we're just going to stitch here. Close that, and we'll close that, and we'll just stitch. Okay, so now you can see what's happening here with this knit is because of all of that pressure that sits on this foot, sometimes the feeding won't be as smooth. So what you can actually do is you can go into your machine settings and engage, and I have found I've done this, I engage the fabric sensor because that lightens that up. The other thing that you can do too is you can adjust that foot pressure to a setting of 2, and that will also help. I'll exit that, and then I'll re-engage that. And in this case, because it's this knit, I will probably lengthen out that stitch length to a 3.0, and then I will continue to stitch. And I got off a little bit on that seam allowance, so we'll just readjust that, and that was due to that feeding. Remember, you always have opportunities to make adjustments on things, and as I said earlier, I always practice. And can you see immediately how that made that change and how that fabric was feeding? By just adjusting that fabric sensor and adjusting that foot pressure. You don't have to do both. Sometimes it's just that fabric sensor that you're going to adjust, and you can see how easily that is now feeding. World of difference. And then again, making that adjustment to that stitch length. And when we take a look at this, what you'll see is that here, that looks really nice. And can you see how, even though I had that at 3/8, that was really off? That's where you have that opportunity to make those changes on your machine, and just know that that's all there. We gave you all the tools on the machine. It's just a matter of using them with the projects that you're working on. Next, we'll take a look at a 5-inch seam, which I think that's probably the one most of us are familiar with. We've used it in sewing patterns for a very long time. I'm going to go to that sub line, and I'm going to adjust that to 5/8 of an inch. And probably what I will do, and you saw the 1/2 inch, you can do 1/2 inch also, but that's not on the template, so just be aware of that. We're going to do that 5/8. I'm going to close that. I might go back and actually take my foot pressure, adjust that, and take that back to the 3 because I'm now on a woven. I'm going to leave that fabric sensor on because I found that when I worked with the Guideline foot, I like that fabric sensor on for the movement of the fabric, but there'll be times where you're not going to want that on because you want a little bit more stability. We're going to slide that underneath. We're going to engage our Guideline. That's one thing you always have to remember. And there you can see how beautiful that is along that, and we're just going to stitch that 5/8 inch seam. Again, if that line happens to fall off the edge of the fabric, what do you always have? You have those dashes on that template, and that's where that template really comes into play. And always remember, you have left needle and you also have center needle. And we'll just keep stitching to the end. And then we'll just put a piece of denim under here, so you see you've got this lightweight linen, and you can see how pretty that is. And we'll just put a piece of denim underneath there, because everybody likes to make blue jeans. It's the real popular thing right now. And again, we have some markings that you really can't see. You can adjust those. And I actually left this open while I was stitching, which you can certainly do. And if I change that to white, how about turquoise? How about the dark green? Yeah. And then we're going to go ahead, we'll just close that, and we'll start stitching. And again, what I'm always watching is this area in here, and I'm watching, in this case, both my Guideline marker on that fabric edge, because it does fall off a little bit, but that's where I'm using, again, those dashed lines from the template markings all the way to the end. And then I've got my 5/8 inch seam on my denim. Okay. So that's how easy it is to use that Guideline foot with the Guideline markers and that template for your seams. Our next technique is half square triangles and flying geese sewing on the bias using the Guideline foot and the Guideline marker. The Guideline foot is ideal for piecing when you're using that Guideline marker system. So the first thing that I'm actually going to do is take off that left needle template that I had in place. You can certainly use that template for the center needle position for that 1/4 inch, but what we're going to do is we're going to actually explore this with just the foot, because we're doing half square triangles, and I actually mark my fabric to do that because I think it's just a little bit easier for me to follow a marked line. And there's a couple ways that you can do this. In this case, you can see I've marked all of my lines, meaning the center, the left, and the right where I would do my stitching. And those are solid lines. In this case, I just did hash lines because it's the same system as that. I just didn't want to spend that much time marking. And then, of course, the last one is just marking that center line. So we're going to start with this one. And the first thing that I'm going to do is go over to my machine, and I actually have to change the position of those markings. So we're going to go back underneath that Guideline marker function, And what I want to do is I'm going to make sure that that subline is set at 1/4 of an inch. So now we're at 1/4 of an inch, and our main line is going to have to be adjusted, because remember, whereas in the left needle, I need to take that over into that right needle position. And if you want to, when you're starting, I don't always think it's a bad idea to maybe just put that template in place so that you can ensure that when you're ready to stitch, that subline is going to be on that marked line. Because remember, I'm going to stitch to the left and to the right of that center line, because that's where I'm going to cut. And I can see I'm fairly well aligned, but I didn't do one thing, and this is going to trip you up because sometimes I forget this. Make sure you change your needle position to that 1-03 or 1-04, so you're putting that needle actually in that center position. Now, when you take a look at the foot, I'm just going to take this template off because I want a clear view of everything. When you take a look at the Guideline foot, it's a long foot and it's a wide foot, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, do I really think I want to use this using a half curved triangle? I'm going to tell you, you do. Here's why. If you look at your standard foot and you look at your 1/4 inch foot, you can see they're a little bit shorter. Actually, they're a lot shorter. But what happens is when you're piecing and you've got that foot there, your fabric tends to move this, right? Tends to move back and forth. So you end up having to control that fabric a little bit more than what you want to, because your concentration really is going to be on where you're stitching to make sure your pieces are accurate. But with the Guideline foot, what happens is I can see immediately that I have the foot taking main control of my fabric. Do you see that's not shifting and moving on me? If I need to make an adjustment to my fabric, which I do right here, I'm just going to slide that over and we'll make that adjustment, lower that foot, and I'll continue stitching. And again, what I'm watching is, and I'm just going to point to this right here, is this sub line. I'm not watching that main line, I'm watching that sub line because that's on my marked line. And I'm going to watch between this point and about this point here where the end is, just making sure that that stays on that marked line. And we'll continue stitching to the end. And if you need to go slow, you certainly can go slow. If you look at where my hands are, again, this kind of just helps that fabric along as I'm stitching. Keep it in place. And again, as I always tell everybody when you're stitching, don't let go of your fabric here and stitch. You want to follow through until your needle comes off of that edge of the fabric. It gets close to that edge of the fabric. Then you can take your hands away and we're going to use that scissors cut. We're going to pull this out and we're going to look at that side. And you can see that that A number 1 is straight, and B number 2, I look like I'm 1/4 of an inch the whole way around. Again, remember when I talked about earlier in my settings page, fabric sensor. I have that fabric sensor on because, again, that alleviates a little bit of that pressure that that foot has on it, so the feeding is nice and smooth. So now I'm ready to go back, and I'm going to do the next side. And again, what you're going to do is you're going to place that sub line, my green line, on my marked line to sew the other side. And if you need to, you can always place a little cheater in front on your needle and start there rather than starting on your fabric piece. And I'll continue stitching down all the way to the end. Again, always watching kind of from this point here. I don't watch my needle because your needle's always going to go up and down in the same spot. You don't need to worry about that. You're watching about that subline because it's really your alignment point for where your main line or your needle is stitching. And we just keep stitching all the way through to the end. And then what we're going to do is we're going to cut that thread, pull that out, and then of course here's that second line. So between these two lines, that should be 1/2 of an inch. Okay, and then what you're going to do is, once you've got that done, you'll actually cut along that marked line so you end up with those two pieces. You'll press them and see how pretty that is, and then you'll put them opposite of one another, and then we'll do the same thing. We will stitch placing again that subline on this marked line, And what we're going to always want to make sure is that we're matched here. So we'll slide that back underneath. And again, that subline sits on my mark line. And then I'm just going to stitch. And you can see how easily you're going over that seam without any issues. The seams are pressing the opposite direction. And this is where I think you kind of want to watch your colors. Sometimes you remember this was kind of a green when we were stitching on just the solid fabric, and now it's a yellow. Always just watch what you're selecting for your lines and make sure that you can see them. And if you have to change them, you have the opportunity to do that. All you have to do is go in that guideline marker position key and make those changes. And here's that first line. And then I would just turn this around and do the exact same thing. Again, subline in position. Get that lined up. And there we go. There we go. And then continue just stitching all the way down. And I really have learned to train my eye to watch the spot I want to watch and ignore everything else. And where my hands are just keeps that fabric in alignment. And we'll continue stitching to the end. Scissors cut. And there's that final piece. And we'll just take a tiny little peek there. And you can see how I'm aligned there. And I'll just take a little peek over here. And I'm off just a little bit. That slipped, but I can easily take that side out and make some readjustments. And once you've got that done, you cut them out. This is what your final pieces look like. And you would trim those up. And then that is doing a half square triangle using that guideline foot in the guideline marker system. So the next one that we're going to take a look at is flying geese. I love flying geese. It's probably one of the easiest patterns that you can work with. And it's kind of the same principle in the sense that you're sewing diagonally. And the reason I wanted to show you this is that when people sew on the bias, they get a little concerned about the fabric stretching as you're sewing. And you notice that didn't happen even with the pressure that this foot has on that fabric. So what I'm going to do is my fabric's going to go underneath. I have 2 lines marked because I'm really only going to worry about stitching on one line. And I'm going to place my subline on the furthest marked because I'm stitching from point to point. And we'll just get this lined up just a little bit better here so that you can see that, okay? Slide that underneath, and that's an easy way to do is just slide that underneath. We'll rotate that, get that lined up. And again, when you lower that foot, what you're going to have to do is be careful. You might have to make a few minor adjustments, and that's real easy to do. Now I'm set and I'm ready to sew. So all that I'm going to do is stitch across from this point to this point. And again, my hands literally sit right here when I sew. And this is how I sew normally anyhow, just to keep my fabric in position. And again, I can't stress enough, your viewpoint is where my fingers are pointing is right here to here. Okay, I'm not worrying about anything past that point because this is where I'm going to, not where I've been or where I'm at. I'm always looking forward. And we'll stitch to this point right here. And you can see I'm coming right up to that corner. I'm going to use that scissors cut. And the test of all tests is to take this and pop it up. And I am set to go with that. So once you have that corner done, then what you'll do is you'll come over and you'll add in, again, that second corner. And in this case, I only have 1 line marked, which happens to be my subline. So we're going to place this underneath the presser foot. And this is where I think the easiest way to look at this is it best for you to mark 1 line? Is it best for you to mark 2 lines? Or is it best for you to mark everything? And I think you'll learn that as you go through this. And I have found that if I can just use the 1 line, which is the subline, I find that my piecing is better because I'm only paying attention to, in a sense, that line, and there's not another marked line on my fabric. And that's not the guideline markers, it's the markings on the fabric that I think that sometimes can get confusing for us. And if you only have 1 there, then I think that you have a better chance of, but start with training wheels, which is marking as much as you need to mark, and then back yourself off as you become more comfortable. Okay, and then you can see the great improvement by just having that one marked line. And again, we'll just flip that up, and there's my flying geese, and I would cut that apart. The last step is, once I have them cut into individual pieces just like this, what I would do is I would sew these two together. So I'm going to just slide that underneath here. And this is probably where I would pop in this template, because I have a seam here. So I'm just going to place that template in position, and we're going to just lock that down on that foot. We're going to slide this underneath, and I'm actually going to start with a cheater because I have that seam. Just get myself started on that fabric edge. And then I'm slide that fabric underneath, again lining up, because remember, I have that template in place. I can use those markings on that template. And then I'm going to stitch, and I'm going to go between my guideline and the dash markings on my template along that fabric edge. And I think that that's where things come in real handy by, again, I said, having that template, is you have that ability to do that. And we're going to go all the way to the end. Flip our thread, and then we'll take a look at our piece. And voila, I probably could have gotten just a little bit closer to that peak, but I think that's pretty darn good. So that is piecing using the guideline foot, the guideline marker, and then adding in that template when you're ready to put your seams together, so you're on that fabric edge, so you know your seams are set. So now we're ready to play with decorative stitches, my favorite thing. So we're ready to start with those decorative stitches, and the first thing I'm going to do is, I actually ended with that template on my guideline foot. I'm going to take the template out because I don't use that with decorative stitches, and we're going to go between utility and character decorative stitches. The first thing I want to do is actually select that stitch. So I'm going to go into the folder number 3, and I like the daisy stitch because I think it's a fun stitch, and we're going to do that at stitch number 306. And we're going to actually change the width of that, and we're going to change the length. So I'm going to go to the widest width, which is 7, and I'm going to go to a stitch length of 4.5. I want it to be a little bit bigger. Now, when I was working with decorative stitches, the one thing that I learned was I really wanted to have that fabric sensor on. So I know we've done it in other sections, but we want to make sure that we haven't made that change. If you need to, remember, you can always make that change to that foot pressure too. So I know I've got that set. My next step is to actually go into the guideline, because there's one change that I'm going to make here is I'm going to turn off that subline. In this case, for this particular stitch, I do not want that subline on, so I'm going to turn that off, and the only line that I will see when I put my fabric underneath my presser foot is going to be that main line. We're going to go back to the main line, and I'm going to leave it here because I might have to make just a minor adjustment to moving that line over, so we're just going to leave this screen open so I can do that. Now, when I was working with the decorative stitches with the guideline foot, a couple of things that I did was I created what I call a stitch journal. And the reason I did this was, first, the foot was new to me. Okay, so it's different than using the standard end foot. And I wanted to build a little bit of confidence and understand how the stitches performed with that foot in place. So you'll notice that I have a number of stitches selected, and I have notes. Like, for instance, in this case, I tried the foot pressure at 2, and I changed that foot pressure to 3. I might have made some adjustments. This is a side feed of stitch number 615, and just my various stitches. Here is a note of that I got off a little bit, and that might have just been my guidance of the fabric as I was moving along. But really what it did was it helped me build confidence, so when I go to my project, I know that I can tackle that, and I understand the foot, I understand the movement of the fabric, and I understand the stitch. So with that being said, I've got my fabric marked, and you can see I have three lines, and we're going to actually stitch this stitch out on, let's say, the center line. I'm going to slide my fabric underneath and raise that toe of that foot, and we're just going to literally lower the presser foot. You can see that my guideline is sitting on that line in. I'm just going to make an adjustment here. And what I want to do is I want to take a look at the actual stitch itself. And in the editing mode, you have two functions that you can use to kind of what I would call audition the stitch. Now again, this would be my testing before I move on to my project. And one of them is going to be that single stitch key, and the other is the back to the beginning. And why do I do the single stitch? That means it's just going to sew one stitch. But really what I'm after is when I put my needle in that down position, I can see, in this case, the needle's a little bit to the left of where that positioning is. So what I want to do is I'm going to go back into that guideline and I'm going to shift that over to 0.5, and then I'm just going to readjust my fabric. So now when my needle comes down, if I take it back to the beginning, my needle comes down, it should be right on that line. So does that make sense? Again, having the ability to do just one pattern allows you to check the placement of where your needle is and where my mark line is and the guideline is. And now I'm actually ready to start. So I'm going to go right to that continuous pattern and I'm going to start stitching. Now, another thing that I have done for years is I find that when we use the foot control, we kind of speed up and slow down on our gas. When I'm working with decorative stitches, I disconnect the foot control and I use my start-stop key. I take my speed down a little bit. And what that allows me to do is really concentrate on what's going on here and not have to worry about doing anything with my foot other than putting my feet up somewhere, maybe on the edge of my koala chair. And now I'm going to start stitching. And I think that's a little faster. So I'm just going to take it down just a little bit more till I feel comfortable. And then I'll take that up. And again, where you're watching is from this point to the end point, and if you need to, remember you can always change that line to the next. So it's just a little bit longer for you to see what's going on. So did you see the difference between that? That's where I typically have that guideline. I'm going to change it to that, meaning the middle medium one, and it just lengthened this out a little bit more so I had a little bit more visibility of my guideline. And then I'm going to hit that start stop and I'm going to stitch. And again, I'm watching really just again from that point to that point as I'm stitching. I'm keeping my hands here. Try not to lift the fabric up like here, what you see me doing there, because that will shift that out of place. And I don't want to do that. I just want to keep my hands here kind of as, in a sense, another guide as you're stitching. And I'll just keep stitching. And when I feel comfortable, I'll take that speed up a little bit higher. And then when I feel really comfortable, I'll actually move on to my project fabric. And then when we get to the point, take back to that center. We're going to take that needle out. We're going to just readjust this just a little bit. There we go. And now I'm in a sense back on track. Again, that's why I personally like the shorter line versus the longer line. I have less to watch per se, so it's just a matter of you figuring out which line you want. And if you need to, you can always again readjust that line if your alignment tends to be off a little bit. And we'll just stitch it a little bit more and then we'll take a look at my fabric piece. And if you'll notice where my fingers are here, because again, like I said, that the movement of that fabric, while it is just a straight, it's not one of the side feed stitches, that fabric does move back and forth. So that's where that foot comes in really handy, holding onto it. If you were to use a standard presser foot, that fabric would probably be moving all over and you would not be as straight with your stitching as you would be with the guideline foot. Okay, and so we're going to end this. We're going to go to one pattern. It's ended. And then we'll take a look at my stitching here. And you can see I made adjustments as I was going along. And here I got right on track towards the end. So that's why we practice, is to get that whole system down of understanding the movement of the fabric, where the guideline sits, where you're watching, and how everything is stitching out. So let's take a look at another stitch. And the one that we're going to look at now is actually going to be in our Q folder, and it is one that a lot of us like to use when we are stitching. It's actually called Q32. It's a little different than some of the other appliques. This one actually has 1 vertical stitch, 2 horizontal, and we're going to make an adjustment. We'll just length that out to a 3, and you can immediately see that what happens here is that my guideline, if I look at my foot, is right on that mark. There's my needle, and when I bring that needle into that down position, you can see it's to the right. So 2 things that I could do, and one of them is I could adjust the position of that guideline, or what I could do is I could just left-right shift the needle over so that when it comes down, I need to go back to the beginning because I took a stitch. Let's go back. So when the needle comes down, it's going to come down on that line. I am still off just ever so slightly, so I'll just bring it over 1 more tick, and I should be good to go. And there I go. So did everybody see how that went? Really what I did was, rather than adjusting my guideline, I adjusted the position of the foot. So this is just another way for you to approach alignment of your stitch, is rather than going into the guideline and doing that, just do it right here with the left-right shift if you have that possibility with that particular stitch. And in this case I do. And now I'm aligned, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue stitching all the way down. Take that back to continuous, and we're set. Back to the beginning and continuous, and now we're set, and we'll just keep stitching down, and you can see how that is aligning while I am stitching. So always remember, the machine has lots of different tools that you can use to also help with making minor adjustments to a particular stitch, and this happens to be one of those. Is just use that left-right shift. And again, my guideline is still where it needs to be, and I'm constantly watching it from this point to that end point. And we'll just stitch a little bit more, and then we'll take a look at our stitch. And if you want to, you can always adjust your width and your length, just depending upon how you want to do that. Because again, this is a practice piece. That's all that it is. It's not your final piece. You can make changes, you can make adjustments, you can make minor mistakes, but that's how you learn, that's how you understand, again, the foot, the guideline, and actually the stitching with those 2 pieces. Okay, and we're going to stop, we're going to cut, and we're going to take a look. And you can see how literally how that's lined up when I did that. And this is probably just some minor adjustments on the fabric moving back and forth, and I could easily correct that. But again, that's how that's going to work with this type of stitch. And this is just in the utility stitch. Now, you're going to do the same thing with all the other stitches here. You're going to always want to test them first to figure out A, if you need to use a left-right shift, or B, where you need to make the position of that guideline, meaning moving it to the left to the right, to make sure that you have that alignment. So now we're going to go into the character decorative stitch mode. And typically in this mode, what you have is you have stitches that, in a sense, kind of travel. Okay, you'll also oftentimes hear them referred to as left, right, but I call them their traveling stitch. This is one of the traveling stitches, and it actually is probably one of my favorite stitches. You also have a star or daisy stitch there, but we're going to concentrate on stitch number 615. And when we take a look at that, we can see that it is a larger stitch, because look at that stitch width and then look at that stitch length. So that immediately tells you that this stitch is going to do a little bit more than just stitch straight forward. Now, again, you have the ability with this stitch to go back to those 2 keys I talked about earlier, meaning that single stitch, and then of course you're going to always do the back to the beginning. So this is what a single stitch of this is going to look like. So I've got my guideline set up on that, and remember, I had adjusted that position over to the left just a little bit. So we're going to leave it there for right now while we do our testing. And so you can see that that travels. Now, with the traveling stitches, one of the things that I always found difficult was when the stitch got to this point here, I lost my reference point. So what I have done is I have added the subline, okay? And what that does is that allows me to, if I change that position, so I move it over to the left, Now the subline will remain on my marked line. The main line will be where my needle is. And it keeps my fabric straight and it keeps my stitches aligned and straight. So what I do is I always make little notes of where that's going to be as far as my settings. So I'm going to go do this based on a setting I had marked earlier where I had tested, and I decided that the 0 for my main was good, and on my sub I wanted that to be at that -6. And I'm going to leave it right there in case I need to make any changes. And this is where I really want that to use that start-stop key. I'm going to press that, and I'm going to just kind of guide my fabric and watch it go. And as you can see, as I move across, oops, one thing I forgot to do was tell it I wanted to sew this continuously. So we'll go back here. And now I'm sewing continuously, and here we go there. And we're going to move back over. And again, that main line is my needle. The sub line is on my marked line. Main line comes back over to my marked line, and then it will go back over to the left. And I'm going to keep that as I'm stitching. And it really just kind of helps you keep your fabric straight so that it doesn't kind of go kittywampus like that and you don't realize that. It allows you to do that. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this just for a second, and I'm going to go back into my guideline, and I'm going to take that back to that -5, and then I'm going to continue stitching. Every time the stitch goes to the right, one of those lines remains on my mark line. When it goes to the left, again, one of those guidelines remains on that marked line on my fabric, and it just helped me keep my fabric straight versus going kind of sideways or kittywampus. And it was, for me, it was a very nice guideline. It was a very nice security blanket per se, that I always knew that when I was done with my stitching, it would not only be aligned on my marked line, but it would be straight and it wouldn't be crooked. So that's why when I use the side stitches or the side feed stitches, I will develop a method of, okay, what's the width of the stitch? Where does it kind of fall on the marked line? And where do I need to set that subline at in relationship to the main line? And then I just use those 2 lines as my alignment point. I keep my hands literally right here, just kind of guiding it a little bit so that it doesn't get off kilter. And as we come back again now on this one, that pink line, which is my main line, should be or close to being on that marked line. And when I get to the end point, I'm just going to stop and I'm going to cut those threads, and then we'll just take a look at it. And really also what it does too is it sets it up so that I have that stitch right there on that line where I want that to be and where it should be. If I go off point or you go off point, it's going to hit there. But again, it is a practice piece. You are learning, and it's also not just watching those 2 markings and them aligning on that mark that I have on my fabric. It's learning how the fabric moves back and forth and where your hands need to be. And again, having that ability to have those 2 lines projected on your fabric and they align with each other and they kind of act as a track system, I think that's where you're going to be more successful when you go into some of these character decorative stitches, and you have a lot more fun and you feel more confident and you actually use all these beautiful stitches that are built into your machine. Now there's one more stitch that I wanted to show you real quick before we exit this portion, and this is actually also a daisy stitch, and this one is a little bit bigger and it's just as fun. I'm actually going to take off the subline on this one, but it does track a little bit, but not as much as that other stitch 615 that we did. So we're going to take that subline, we're going to take it in the off position, and we are just going to stitch. And again, I want to just do that 1 stitch, and I want to take that down, and I'm right on point. And if you look at my guideline, I'm a little bit to the left. So just be cautious of the fact that you always want to align everything before you start stitching. Okay, So we'll just stitch this one, and you can see how this one kind of tracks a little bit. It's very similar. It goes over. And the reason I didn't do the subline on this is because really the movement of the stitch is so little that what I do is I watch my main line, and just the line will go to the right, and then the line will just go to the left of my mark line, and then it will come back over and it will just sit on the right. So learn to use the guidelines that you need for the stitch that you're doing and the movement of the fabric while you're stitching. And that, I think, will help you a lot with the character decorative stitches and using the guideline foot with that guideline marker. And we'll just take a look at this one and see how we're doing. So far, so good. And I think I'm going to get to the end where I'm going to end this. We're just got one stitch. And this is a little bit bigger than what you had in the standard utility mode. If you look at that, you've got an 8.5 width and a 9.4 length, so it's much bigger. And then we're going to end this, and we're just going to take a look at this one. And you can see how basically spot on point that is. And that was just using the main line, but knowing where it fell on each time it went to the right and to the left. So the one thing we have is you have the ability to use that subline with the main line to adjust where you're going to, in a sense, that stitch is going to land by those lines matching up on my mark line, or you can use just the main line to do it. It's just an easy way to get these stitches to perform the way you want them to form and look the way that you want them to look. So that is our decorative stitch mode, and now we're going to move on to quilting. So now we're going to explore quilting using the guideline foot and the guideline marker. I have a couple of samples that I'm going to show you of some quilting styles that I played with. Again, these are practice pieces. I just did straight lines, and I just think it's kind of always a fun look to your fabric. And this is actually going to be that poly. This is, I think, a low loft, and I have 2 layers in there. I did mark my lines because for me, again, learning it was an easy way for me to learn. And then this is just kind of like that Chanel look, or that little grid pattern that you have going on, and I experimented a little bit. And then the last one is that serpentine stitch, which I think all of us really love because it just gives a real unique look and effect. And this is actually with foam in it, the double-sided foam in it, and just stitching on it on those marked lines. And you can see how dramatic that ends up being. And using the guideline foot is really fun because, again, you have all of that sitting on your fabric, holding it down, and nothing's going to go anywhere. So I'm ready to start my quilting, and we're just going to take a look at what I've got set up here in my sandwich. I've got my main fabric, I've got my batting, and this is just a low loft polyester, and then I have my backing fabric. When I go over to my screen, I actually am going to do stitch number 103, and I know that I want a little bit longer stitch length, so I'm going to start at 3.5. I may take it up a little bit. We'll just see what happens when I start that initial stitching. Then we're going to go to our machine settings. And remember, I have been using the fabric sensor, and I know from experience I actually want to take that off because I want that foot to actually be on that fabric and not kind of, in a sense, float and adjust for that so it feeds properly. And I'm going to take my foot pressure to 4. I kind of hover when I found out when I was experimenting that I had that between 3 and 4 for that foot pressure. And then my final step is going to be engaging that guideline marker. And I'm going to just use the main line. I still have it set at that position where it's bumped it forward. And I've got it set at the 0, 0. And we're just going to leave it there. We may need to make a few adjustments that we'll just see once we get our fabric underneath our presser foot. And I'm just going to go ahead and slide this up to my needle. And I'm going to align my needle with that marking. And I'm not going to make any adjustments until I lower my presser foot. So once I lower my presser foot, you can see how that line changed a little bit. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and use the needle down position to put my needle in the fabric to see if I need to make any adjustments. And when we do that, what we want to watch is we want to watch the position from here to here. Now I noticed that I went to the medium line. I'm going to take that actually back to that smaller line. I tend to like that. For me, everybody's going to have their own setting. The one thing you want to stay away from is just that very long line. Now we're going to start stitching, and I have my speed set at a medium, so I'm usually between a medium and a fast on this. And you can see as I'm going, what I'm doing is I'm holding my hands here and I'm making sure that I'm watching that guideline while I'm stitching. And if I want to, I can maybe lengthen that stitch length to 4. It really kind of depends upon the look that you're after for your particular piece that you happen to be working on. And I kind of get mesmerized by that guideline sitting in the position where it needs to be. And when I'm done, I'll take a look as far as where my stitching falls on my mark line. If it's off by a tiny thread, I am not going to worry about that, because I think once you get all your stitching in, you're not even going to see that. So I cut that thread, I'm going to raise that presser foot, and we're going to take a look at that. And you can see right here, I just have a little bit blip up. I'm probably going to leave that. And we're going to go to our next line again. We're going to slide that underneath, and we're going to do one more line, and then we're just going to have a small little conversation about a couple of things that I do as far as my prepping goes. And again, we're just going to keep stitching. And I always find that doing this as fast as you possibly can while maintaining control is always the best. And you can see what my hands are doing as I'm moving. They're literally sitting out here on the right hand side, just kind of holding that fabric in place. And if you need to, let's say I want to bump that needle, remember you have that left right shift to just pop that over, and that adjusts the position of that needle in an instant, and I don't have to adjust that guideline. So again, those two kind of work in tandem with one another, meaning being able to adjust that needle position versus adjusting that guideline marker. So when you look at my samples and everything that I've been doing, you notice that I do a fair amount of marking, and part of that is for the video. And in this case, I have used, I've got them over here on the side, I tend to use these friction pens simply because you can see them on screen. And that way it makes it a little easier for you to follow what I'm doing. In real life, I typically don't use a friction pen, and part of the reason is on some fabrics it does leave a residue. My go-tos is a tailor's chalk that actually is what we call a wax chalk, and why I love this is that it will disappear on its own, or you can take it to an iron and it will disappear. It will not leave any markings on your fabric. But here's a warning, or actually 2 warnings. The first warning is don't mark everything one night and expect it to be there when you come down in the morning, because it will be gone. So you'll be remarking. And then the second thing is it does have a little bit of dust when you're stitching. So you will kind of feel that when you're stitching. The other thing that I want to talk about is that this is a plain piece of fabric that I've marked. And again, it was for video. And even if I were doing this in real life, I personally would probably mark this. You may not. So there's a couple avenues that you can use. You can use the guideline marker. You can use the sub-guideline marker as long as it sits in the foot, and you kind of alternate between. You can use a quilt guide with the guideline marker. But remember, when you're probably doing this, you're doing it in a project. You're finishing a project. You're quilting a project. So you have one thing I don't have. You have design lines and you have seam lines. And those are great to put that guideline, so you don't have to mark. You just have to adjust the position of your subline to put on that seam or on that design line, and then your main line is your stitching line. So just keep that in mind when you're watching the video, that this is set up so that you can see how all of this functions. It's not necessarily what you're going to do when you quilt that wonderful little table runner that you've done, and you've got those stitch lines and you've got those design lines. And again, the friction pen is for video only. Use your favorite tool. As I said, mine is those wax tailor's chalk. I also have a mechanical pencil that gives me a really fine chalk line, or you can use something like a chalk liner. Just use your preference point. So I hope all these tips will help you with your journey with the guideline foot.